Gunfire stitched the steel corridor, and the alarms lagged behind the bullets. Michael Ward said, "This hallway was green-lit. Smoke rolled like a curtain, and the floor glittered with glass teeth. A soldier slid down the wall, clutching a chest wound, lips working around a name that shouldn't exist." Sarah Ward said, "Michael, get down," but the radio hissed with dead air. A red barrel burned at the far turn, and paper snow spun from its mouth. Michael Ward said, "Who cleared this sector?" A single page spiraled past his boot, stamped with a phrase that fought the light. He grabbed it and felt heat bite his fingers. The dying soldier caught Michael's sleeve and said, "Find Kane." The sprinklers coughed, and then drowned the muzzle flashes in smeared silver rain. Boots hammered above, organized and wrong. Michael Ward said, "We were set up." A shadow crossed the smoke like a blade. The barrel collapsed inward with a wet sigh, and the page in his hand refused to burn. The corridor emptied into a loading bay that smelled of wet diesel and singed paint. Michael Ward said, "This was a friendly zone." Rainwater funneled through a roof seam and drew a dark line across the concrete. A forklift idled with no driver, and a crate bled paper strips from a shattered seal. Sarah Ward said, "They're erasing as they move." The radio crackled once and went still like it was listening. Footsteps returned as echoes, not people. Michael Ward said, "Kane." The name felt heavy, as if the bay itself had heard it before. A security camera rotated toward them and then away with deliberate indifference. Michael Ward said, "We need a copy of that page before it vanishes again." The sprinklers shut off mid-drip and silence grew loud. Somewhere above, a metal door closed with a careful hand. They crossed to the office cage where clipboards hung like mute witnesses. Michael Ward said manifest should list who shipped the burn barrel. A keypad blinked green, then red, as if reconsidering its loyalties. The glass was webbed, but the lock was precise work. Sarah Ward said, "They had time and a key." He pressed a palm to the door and felt warmth where it should be cold. Paper dust floated in the beam of a flickering task lamp. "I knew." Michael Ward said, "If this page says do not exist, someone does." He slid the page into a plastic sleeve and the words looked angrier. A printer in the back room woke, sighed, and died. Michael Ward said, "We are not alone in here." The office air carried a whisper of cologne that did not belong to either of them. A second corridor led to a stairwell painted with old directives and newer lies. Michael Ward said, "If boots were above us, we find their trail." The steps were wet and showed no prints, which was its own warning. A door at the landing bore a sticker half torn, the rest reading Kane Supply. Sarah Ward said, "Coincidence or a message?" He tested the handle and felt the subtle give of a latch held by a string. Michael Ward said, "Trap or theater?" He cut the string and opened to a room where crates made careful walls. A fan ticked on a timer, pushing paper smell and burnt ink. Michael Ward said, "They want us to follow." The timer clicked to 0, and the fan stopped like a sentence ended. Inside the room, the crates formed a corridor of their own, ending at a table set like an altar. Michael Ward said, "They curated this." A metal tray held a lighter, a blank ID badge, and a photo with faces blacked out. Sarah Ward said, "Someone is telling us a story." He lifted the photo, and the blackout ink shone like oil. Michael Ward said, "If this is bait, I'm already on the hook." The lighter bore a unit crest he knew too well. Sarah Ward said, "That crest is retired." The air hummed with the power of a camera that wasn't visible. Michael Ward said, "They want to see me take it." He pocketed the crest, and the humming grew brighter in his bones. The motel room reeked of bleach and stale coffee, its walls humming with the memory of those who stayed before. Michael Ward said, "Cheap rooms hide expensive secrets." He peeled back the curtain and caught the shadow of a van parked too long beneath the flickering streetlight. Sarah Ward said, "That van hasn't moved since we got here." She rubbed her arms against the chill seeping through thin walls. On the bed, the page in its sleeve looked like it glared at them. Michael Ward said, "They're watching to see if I flinch." A television blinked static, then snapped black. He unplugged it, certain a lens lurked inside. Sarah Ward whispered, "You think Kane lived in shadows like this?" Michael Ward said Kane died twice, once in the field and once on paper. He pressed his hands over his face, medals flashing in memory, each one louder than a gunshot. Sarah touched his arm gently and said, "You're not alone." But the silence that followed suggested otherwise. The knock at the door was soft but final. Michael Ward said, "They don't use the lobby." He reached for his sidearm, breathing shallow. Sarah Ward pressed against the wall, pulse hammering, whispering, "Don't open it." A second knock came, followed by silence, then the hum of a car engine outside. Michael stepped closer, eyes narrowing on the thin gap of light under the door. Shadows shifted beyond it. Michael Ward said, "If it's them, they already know we're here." He snapped the lock, but held the handle tight, daring the unseen visitor to force it. Folded slip slid under the door, curling on the floor like a threat. Sarah Ward said, "Don't touch it." Michael picked it up anyway. The slip carried a single line, "This mission does not exist." He stared at the words, heart pounding like the hallway was collapsing inward. They drove out before dawn, headlights off along forgotten roads. Michael Ward said, "Only ghosts use these routes." The horizon carried bruised purple and steel gray. The day reluctant to begin. Sarah Ward sat rigid in the passenger seat, hands gripping a file too thin to survive. She whispered, "If this van tails us, we'll never know." He checked the mirror, every passing fence post turning into an enemy. Michael Ward said, "Trust only what you see, and even then doubt it." The van from the motel appeared briefly, lights flicking, then vanished behind a curve. Michael Ward's jaw clenched. Sarah said, "Then Kane is real, isn't he?" Michael answered, "Real enough to make them kill for it." Gravel spat under the tires, the road narrowing like a throat. The air inside thickened with fear and fuel, as though each breath had a weight. They reached the diner at the crossroads where truckers and drifters blended into the same silence. Michael Ward said, "No safer place than where no one cares." The bell above the door rattled, announcing ghosts rather than customers. Sarah Ward slid into a booth, eyes on the window's reflection. A waitress with lined eyes and tired kindness poured black coffee that steamed like warnings. Michael Ward whispered, "Watch, who leaves, not who enters." A man in the far corner lowered his newspaper an inch too slowly, his gaze sharpening like glass. Sarah Ward said, "That one doesn't eat here often." Michael sipped coffee, bitterness cutting deeper than caffeine. The slip of paper burned against his pocket. The stranger folded his paper, rose and left, but his untouched plate screamed louder than a siren. Michael Ward said he wasn't here for food. The motel slip lay on the table between salt shakers and half-drained mugs. Michael Ward said, "We chase ghosts, they chase us back." Sarah Ward whispered, "We can't keep running." He answered, "Running is survival until truth is stronger than fear." The diner clock ticked too loud, marking time no one wanted. A truck engine roared outside, shaking the windows, and the man with the newspaper appeared in the glass reflection, though he had already left. Michael Ward pressed his hand flat on the slip, his pulse visible. He said, "We dig, Sarah, even if it buries us." The waitress returned with a refill, eyes soft with pity as though she knew. Sarah Ward said, "Then we start with Kane's trail." Michael Ward nodded slowly, silence between them stretching like a rope about to snap. The storage unit smelled like old rubber and nervous sweat, the kind of place secrets molt. Michael Ward said, "We meet, we leave, no footprints." Padlocks clicked like teeth around them. Sarah Ward said, "If he shows at all." A fluorescent tube shivered and made the dust look alive. Michael paced the narrow aisle, counting vents and exits as if prayer had measurements. He said, "Our allies are turning into voicemails." A note under a tarp read, "Key under mat," but there was no mat. Sarah said, "They're teasing us." He opened a crate and found a phone that rang without a number. A whisper said, "Stop asking about Kane," and the line died like a small animal in winter. They drove the long way to the river and parked where fog made everything equal. Michael Ward said, "Read it again slower." Sarah Ward traced the stamp's edges like it could confess. She said, "The header is a ghost, the footer is a map." He spread the page across the hood, river breeze rattling the corner like a nervous tick. Michael Ward said, "Do not exist" is a routing set, not a warning. The letters hid coordinates when folded, a schoolyard trick with grave results. Sarah Ward said, "Operation Wraith." The word tasted like old coins on her tongue. A black sedan paused on the bridge and turned off its lights. Michael Ward said, "We have company who prefers silhouettes." They met Daniel Cross at a veterans hall that smelled of floor wax and broken promises. Michael Ward said, "You signed my citation." Daniel smiled like a man measuring a grave. He said, "You earned what you could carry." Sarah Ward watched the door, counting strangers who pretended not to hear. Michael laid the page sleeve on the table, and the room seemed to lean closer. Daniel whispered, "Fold it wrong, and you lose a year." He slid it back with 2 fingers, careful as if it bled. Michael Ward said, "Who wrote Wraith?" Daniel said, "People who loved the flag more than the people." His eyes hardened and then softened, which was worse than either. They slipped into a municipal data center behind a delivery cart and borrowed confidence. Michael Ward said, "Cameras first, then logs." The server room breathed like a sleeping beast. Sarah Ward found a console and coaxed it awake with practiced patience. A prompt flashed red, then politely denied their existence. Michael said, "We're erased in here too." He traced cable labels, the tidy veins of a bureaucratic giant. Sarah Ward said, "Here's a backdoor signed by a ghost." Footsteps approached, measured and unhurried. Michael cut the feed to black and listened to silence shape itself into a man. He said, "We have to leave like we were never here." They returned to the motel and found their lives rearranged by invisible hands. Michael Ward said they tidied the crime they planned. The bed was made tighter than the truth. Sarah Ward opened the closet and stared at a suit that was not theirs. A photo sat on the nightstand, their faces replaced with blank ovals. Michael Ward said, "Propaganda aimed at 2 people." The slip on the table was gone and replaced by a room key from a hotel 3 states away. Sarah said, "They want us traveling on their map." Tires hissed outside like snakes in the rain. Michael Ward said, "Then we changed destinies the old way, on foot and off script." The coordinates led to a shuttered archive whose windows wore dust like armor, and whose locks clicked with old authority. Michael Ward said, "Paper is slower to lie." Inside, rows of gray cabinets exhaled a stale breath that felt rehearsed. Sarah Ward said, "If Wraith is real, it's filed like a rumor." They found a drawer labeled with a number that matched their page when folded, a child's trick in a graveyard. Michael slid it open and met emptiness that looked curated. He said, "They kept the shadows and threw away the bodies." A single microfilm roll waited like bait. Sarah loaded it, and the projector coughed up images of staged firefights, smoke pots and actors in enemy kit. Michael Ward said, "They built ghosts, and we hunted them." A frame paused on medals pinned in a tent, the same crest he carried like a wound. Sarah whispered, "They filmed the ceremony twice, once with you, once without you." The screen fluttered and then burned white as the bulb died on cue. They stood in a stairwell where every echo sounded like someone deciding. Michael Ward said, "Who benefits if the enemy is rented by the hour?" Sarah Ward stared through the handrail like it could confess. She said, "You should hear something I should have told you sooner." The word Kane landed between them like a dropped tool. She said, It was my name before it was erased. Michael did not move, as if staying still could stop the past from starting again. Sarah said, "He was my brother, and they told me he died clean." She folded her hands like a prayer that had lost its church. Michael Ward said, "You walked me into this knowing his ghost was ours." Her voice cracked on a truth that cut both ways. She said, "I thought if we found proof, we would fix the lie." The stairwell hummed with a power line's tired certainty, and the silence left them standing on different steps. Daniel Cross called from a number that looked freshly minted and asked for a meeting where the city forgot its river. Michael Ward said, "If he runs, we follow. If he stays, we test him." The pier creaked like an old oath as fog braided itself around pilings. Daniel arrived with hands visible and a smile that tried too hard. He said, "You're trespassing in a museum of mistakes." Michael placed the sleeve on a bench and watched Daniel's eyes more than his hands. Daniel said, "You think Wraith is one operation. It is a franchise." Sarah Ward said, "And you are a shareholder." He laughed, a quiet sound that wanted no witnesses. Daniel said, "You want justice. I sell continuity." He motioned behind them, and the fog answered with the outline of men who had practiced this welcome. Michael Ward said, "You were the friend who kept the door unlocked." The step behind them was soft and final, a lesson in professional courtesy. Shadow Operative Reed said, "You could have stayed decorated and silent." His voice carried the temperature of metal. Michael Ward said, "You sell mercy like spare parts." Reed stepped closer until the air organized itself around him. He said, "Your medals kept the funding alive, and alive is what nations prefer." Sarah Ward said, "You filmed the fires and called them battles." Reed's eyes did not change, which was their trick. He said, "Narratives do not need all the facts, only enough facts." Michael felt the page in his pocket warm like a coal that refused to die. Reed said, "I am here to recover a story and delete 2 witnesses." The fog moved aside as if it knew rank. Michael Ward said, "Then you should have brought more than policy." A phone rang from nowhere and everywhere, a sound that cut clean through fog and theater. Sarah Ward said, "Answer it," though none of them had dialed. Michael lifted his device and found no call, yet the voice arrived. It said, "Stop calling me dead." The pier forgot to creak. "Michael Ward," said, "Name yourself." The voice laughed once like gravel. It said, "Kane serves where paper cannot follow." Sarah's breath left her like a held note finally released. She said, "If you're alive, they used you to bury us." The voice said, "They used me to bury everyone." Reed stood very still, which was the first honest thing he had done. Michael Ward said, "Tell us where to turn this into light." The voice said, "You already turned it on." Then the fog rolled forward as if pushed by a new weather, and the call died without a goodbye. The hangar yawned wide like a jaw ready to snap shut, lights stuttering in long rows across its ribs of steel. Michael Ward said, "This is where ghosts come to land." Sarah Ward clutched the file, her breath short and sharp. Daniel Cross waited by a crate, shadows nesting at his feet. He said, "You could have walked away." Michael said, "I'd rather crawl forward." The air trembled with the hum of engines beyond the far doors. Sarah whispered, "It's not cargo, it's evidence." Daniel stepped forward, smile cracking under the weight of what he carried. He said, "Truth is heavier than bombs." Michael drew his sidearm and aimed low, ready to break the script. Daniel said, "They'll bury you under ribbons, not dirt." The hangar swallowed the words like a chamber built to keep secrets breathing. Engines roared, and the hangar doors cracked open with the sound of grinding bones. Shadow Operative Reed stepped through, each stride rehearsed like punctuation. He said, "Your choice has expired." Michael Ward said, "You confuse silence with victory." Sarah Ward edged backward, eyes darting between exits and allies turned threats. Daniel Cross said, "Reed, they won't make it out alive." Reed's face betrayed no investment, only obligation. Michael lowered his weapon a fraction, then said, "You kill stories, not soldiers." Reed replied, "There is no difference." The wind from the engines whipped paper strips into a blizzard of forgotten reports. Sarah whispered, "We have to burn the truth before they bury us with it." Michael nodded, stepping closer to the center light, daring Reed to take the first shot. The floor rattled under the vibration of engines, and Michael could feel his metals burn under his shirt like brands. He said, "Every lie they pinned on me came from here." Sarah Ward said, "Then tear them off." Daniel Cross lifted a folder and tossed it to the ground, pages scattering like feathers. He said, "I kept copies, but not for justice, for leverage." Michael glared, words bitter as blood. He said, "You sold honor for protection." Reed raised his weapon and said, "Enough history lessons." Sarah darted forward, seizing a page before the wind claimed it. She said, "Kane's name is here." Reed's eyes flicked, the first betrayal of calm. Michael said, "Even your machine couldn't erase him." The hangar roared louder, drowning everything but the truth that refused to stay dead. Shots cracked, ricocheting across steel ribs. Michael dove behind a crate, Sarah rolling beside him, page clenched in her fist. Reed advanced like gravity itself, each step crushing the space between life and silence. Daniel Cross shouted, "Stop, they'll kill me too," but his voice broke into panic. Michael said, "They already did. You just didn't read the notice." The gunfire painted sparks along the beams, light and shadow playing like conspirators. Sarah whispered, "We can't outgun him." Michael said, "We outlast him." He fired once, grazing Reed's shoulder, forcing the operative to blink for the first time. Reed steadied calm as ever and said, "Delays don't change outcomes." Michael whispered back, "But they change who lives to tell them." The fight stilled as suddenly as it had started, silence carved sharp by smoke and echoes. Michael rose, weapon still trembling, sweat shining on his jaw. Reed lowered his pistol, but not his gaze. He said, "This ends when the page does." Sarah Ward stepped forward, holding it out like a fragile truce. She said, "Then see the line you couldn't erase." Reed the name Kane, and for the first time his mask slipped, if only by a fraction. Daniel Cross whispered, "You don't understand. Kane isn't missing, he is in command." Michael's breath froze, the weight of betrayal settling heavier than bullets. He said, "You let me fight ghosts while he pulled the strings." The hangar's engines cut off, plunging the room into sudden quiet. Sarah whispered, "Then the real war hasn't even started." The night bled into dawn as Michael and Sarah staggered from the hangar, smoke rising behind them like a memory that refused to fade. Michael Ward said, "If Kane is alive, then every medal on my chest is soaked in his shadow." Sarah Ward whispered, "Then the machine made you its monument." They reached an abandoned rail yard where freight cars rusted like discarded bones. Michael pressed his hand against the cold steel, steadying his breath. He said, "The world will never see these scars unless we rip them open." Sarah replied, "And if we do, they'll erase us quicker than ink." Michael looked at the stamped page folded in her hands and said, "The page is their weakness. It proves ghosts bleed." The rails sang faintly under distant weight, a warning that someone else was already coming. The whistle of a freight engine echoed like a confession. Michael Ward said, "They ride the rails because tracks don't question cargo." Sarah Ward crouched near the gravel, tracing boot prints pressed fresh into the dirt. She whispered, "Someone's ahead of us, light and fast." Michael adjusted his jacket, metals digging into his ribs like accusations. He said, "Every trail leads back to Kane and every step costs us more." Sarah lifted her eyes to the horizon, where the sun smeared gold across ash clouds. She said, "Then we run into the fire instead of away." The clatter of loose metal made both freeze, a shadow slipping between boxcars. Michael Ward raised his weapon, jaw tight, and muttered, "If he's real, let him face me as a man, not a phantom." Daniel Cross limped into view, jacket torn, face pale as chalk. Michael Ward said, "You still breathing means they need a messenger." Daniel coughed, eyes dark with dread. He said, "Kane isn't who you think. He's command now, not casualty." Sarah Ward's mouth tightened, her voice breaking. She said, "You knew, and still dragged us deeper." Daniel dropped to his knees, gravel clinging to his palms. He said, "You don't fight systems. You survive them." Michael's hand twitched on his weapon, fury wrapped in restraint. He said, "Survival without truth is just slower death." Sarah whispered, "He deserves nothing but silence." Daniel's eyes watered, his smile more of a flinch. He said, "Kane ordered me to keep you busy while he erased the rest." The whistle blew again, louder, cutting off excuses. A train screeched past, iron wheels screaming like witnesses forced to watch. Michael dragged Daniel behind a concrete barrier as sparks showered in the wind. Michael Ward said, "If Kane runs this, then Reed was just the knife, not the hand." Sarah Ward crouched low, shielding the page with her coat. She said, "Then Kane doesn't just live, he commands." Daniel shook, words rattling free. He said, "They built you both as proof that loyalty can be twisted into theater." Michael pressed his forehead against cold cement, eyes narrowing. He said, "Then it ends with us tearing the curtain." Sarah whispered, "If we do, we may not leave this yard." The thunder of the train began to fade, revealing silence heavy enough to crack bone. As silence returned, a single figure stepped onto the tracks beyond the yard, backlit by the bruised sky. Michael Ward whispered, "If that's Kane, the dead walk in daylight." Sarah Ward's chest rose with a trembling breath, her voice steel wrapped in glass. She said, "Then the war was never over, it just changed uniforms." Daniel Cross whimpered, "He'll bury us alive in their truth." Michael squared his shoulders, jaw tight enough to crack. He said, "I'll face the man who sold blood for ribbons." The figure raised a hand, not in greeting but command, and the rails beneath them vibrated like nerves on fire. Sarah whispered, "Michael, if you do this, there's no going back." He answered, "There was no way back the moment we opened that page." The figure on the tracks did not move, and the rails hummed like a warning you feel in your teeth. Michael Ward said, "You wore my silence like a uniform." The man lowered his hand, and the yard seemed smaller. Sarah Ward said, "Say his name so it finally means something." He smiled with the patience of a practiced sermon and said, "Names are tools." Michael stepped closer, boots clicking on the steel. He said, "Tools break." Wind pushed grit across the ballast, and the distant city blinked like an indifferent witness. The man said, "You were chosen because you could bear the weight, and keep smiling." Sarah said, "He stopped smiling." Michael felt the old metals burn through cloth and said, "I stopped the day you sold us a war." Silence gathered like fog, heavy and close, daring anyone to breathe first. Kane stepped down from the ties with the ease of a man who rehearsed endings. He said, "You think truth saves lives. It only redistributes funerals." Michael Ward said, "Truth saves what is left of a name." Sarah Ward moved to flank the angle of his shadow. She said, "You told me my brother died clean." Kane's eyes softened into something crueler than anger. He said, "He died useful." The words cracked the air like dry bone. Michael lifted the sleeve with the stamped page. He said, "This is your signature written in other people's blood." Kane glanced toward the yard office and didn't bother to deny it. He said, "History thanks the efficient." Sarah said, "History thanks the loud, and we are very loud." Headlights flared at the fence line, and a black SUV idled like a held breath. Shadow Operative Reed stood by the gate with his shoulder bandaged, and his face unreadable. Michael Ward said, "Your knife brought us here." Reed said, "The hand signed it." Kane did not look at him. He said, "Close the gate." Reed did not move, which felt like weather changing. Sarah Ward said, "Even your blade is tired of cutting." Reed's eyes found the stamped words, and for a heartbeat he looked human. He said, "Orders do not bury echoes." Michael stepped between them and said, "Then let this echo carry names." The SUV's engine revved and died, like the machine's cough before surrender. Daniel Cross limped from the shadows with a flare in his shaking hand, painting the yard in bleeding red. He said, "No more whispers." Michael Ward said, "Then hold it high." The flare hissed like a snake, and alarms in the distance answered. Sarah Ward said, "You taught me to read the fold. Now watch me unfold it." She raised the page and the wind lifted it like a flag that hurt to look at. Kane said, "You cannot prove a myth." Michael said, "We can survive it out loud." Reed stepped forward, eyes on the flare, on the page, on the line he had crossed without moving. He said, "Stand down." The echo outlasted the words, and the yard chose a side with its silence. Sirens neared, not as saviors but as witnesses, impossible to manage. Kane said, "You will vanish between statements." Michael Ward said, "His name was never written, but the graves remember." Sarah Ward said, "The war wasn't overseas. It was here all along." Reed holstered his weapon, like a man returning a borrowed sin. Daniel Cross dropped the flare, and the red light died in a hiss. Michael tore the medals from his chest and let them fall like small bright lies. He said, "This mission does not exist." The sirens arrived and the audio cut to a clean, impossible silence, as if someone had closed a file on the night itself.